Unseen Childhood Unveiled. You journey into the rarely explored childhood of Jesus, as depicted in the ancient and controversial Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas. You've probably heard the stories, the ones from the Bible, that paint a picture of Jesus' adult life, his teachings, his miracles, his crucifixion. But what about his childhood? Crickets. Seriously, if you search the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, for anything about Jesus' early years, you'll find, well, next to nothing. Matthew and Luke briefly touch on his birth, a divine arrival, a star, some shepherds, wise men, the whole 9 yards, and then poof, they fast forward straight to his adulthood. Luke throws in a single, rather poignant anecdote about Jesus at the ripe old age of 12, left behind by his parents in Jerusalem, chilling with the temple elders and blowing their minds with his wisdom. And that's about it. You won't find tales of him playing with other kids, scuffing his knees, learning his ABCs, or rather, his aleph and bets, or, more intriguingly, perhaps flexing those divine muscles in a toddler tantrum. It's like the biblical authors decided, nah, let's skip the awkward preteen phase and jump right to the good stuff. But here's the thing, while the authors of the books that became the Bible kept mum, other writers in antiquity were spilling all the tea. Ancient Christian communities circulated several books that contained exactly this type of content, filling in those biographical blanks. And the oldest, perhaps the most popular of these, was a text known as the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas. Now, don't confuse this with the other Gospel of Thomas, which is a different text entirely, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, a kind of ancient self-help book, if you will. The text we're focusing on tonight is the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas, also delightfully known as the Infancy Deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ. This book was a real hit back in the day, circulating in at least 13 languages across antiquity and the Middle Ages. We're talking widespread popularity, folks. There's even a possible reference to it in a text from the 6th century after Christ by Bishop Irenaeus of Lyon, which means this isn't some dusty, forgotten scroll found last Tuesday, it's a truly ancient book. And more than just ancient, it's an extremely curious book. Because the image of the young Jesus it presents goes against pretty much all your expectations. Or at least, it goes against our modern expectations. You know, the gentle, kind, turn-the-other-cheek Jesus. Yeah, prepare for a bit of a shocker. This Jesus is, well, let's just say he's got a temper. Imagine a kid with superpowers who hasn't quite mastered impulse control. That's a good starting point. You're bracing yourself now, aren't you? The book kicks off with Thomas, our ancient narrator, setting the stage. I, Thomas, the Israelite, proclaim to you all, brothers among the Gentiles, to make known the grand childhood of our Lord Jesus Christ, and how many things he did, having been born in our region. From there, a series of moments from Jesus' childhood unfolds, starting with what is perhaps the most famous episode of all. You might even recognize it from the Quran or even some Hollywood movies, where Jesus gives life to some clay birds. But the story, as told in the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas, is much more complex and, frankly, a lot more curious than those simplified versions. The context is this: according to the text, when Jesus was a mere 5 years old, he was playing in a brook. You can almost see him, a little kid, probably wearing a tunic that's a bit too big, squatting by the water. He's separating the waters of the brook into different pools, purifying these waters miraculously, using only the power of his word. No fancy incantations, no magic wand, just pure divine will. And during this playtime, he also takes a handful of clay and molds 12 sparrows. Now, this sounds sweet, right? A child at play, creating art. But then, as always, some killjoy appears. A man sees Jesus doing these things, and because it's the Sabbath, the sacred day of rest, he immediately goes to Joseph, Jesus' earthly father, to tattle. Joseph, you can almost hear him huffing, your son is profaning the sacred day. Joseph, being the responsible father, immediately heads to the brook and confronts the young Jesus. Why are you doing these things on the Sabbath? he asks, probably with a mix of exasperation and parental concern, things that are not allowed. And Jesus, hearing this, doesn't pout, doesn't try to explain himself. He just claps his hands together, a simple, almost dismissive gesture, and says to the sparrows, "Go." And they, astonishingly, immediately come to life and fly away. Everyone who witnessed this was, understandably, amazed. They then rush off to tell the local authorities what had happened, probably trying to make sense of the feathered frenzy they had just witnessed. Historians still argue whether this tale reflects a deeper theological meaning about Jesus' creative power or simply a fascination with miracles in early Christian communities. This story, strange as it may seem on the surface, actually refers to common themes that you also find in the canonical Gospels. For instance, in those more familiar texts, Jesus is also confronted for violating the Sabbath. You know, the whole healing on the Sabbath thing, which always seemed to ruffle some feathers, pun intended. And these 12 sparrows, to which Jesus says, "Go," probably refer to the sending of the 12 apostles, a subtle allegory tucked into a seemingly simple tale of animated mudbirds. You'll see that these allegories appear throughout the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas, adding layers of meaning to the wild escapades of young Jesus. But for now, let's continue with the story of the clay birds, because it gets even more interesting. Miracles and misbehavior. You witness the young Jesus' astonishing powers, from animating clay birds to inflicting harsh, even deadly, consequences on those who cross him. After sending the sparrows on their miraculous maiden flight, the text tells us that the son of a scribe, probably a boy about Jesus' age, comes along. He sees Jesus' handiwork, the carefully separated pools of water, and, perhaps out of mischievousness, or maybe just pure juvenile annoyance, takes a branch and starts breaking up the pools that Jesus had so painstakingly made. You can almost hear the splash, the disruption. And Jesus, seeing this casual act of vandalism, doesn't just shrug it off. Oh no. He unleashes a curse. "Oh, unjust, ungodly, and foolish one," he declares, his young voice probably ringing with surprising authority. "What wrong did the pools and the waters do to you? Behold, now you shall wither as a tree and shall not bring forth either leaves or root or fruit." And just like that, you witness a truly shocking moment. The boy withers completely, right there on the spot. His parents, naturally, are horrified. They go straight to Joseph, complaining bitterly about what had happened. It's like a superpowered game of, he started it, but with genuinely terrifying consequences. But wait, there's more. Because almost immediately after this, another incident unfolds. The young Jesus is crossing the village, perhaps heading home, when another boy, not looking where he's going, runs past him and accidentally bumps into him. A simple childhood collision, right? You'd expect a mumbled apology, maybe a jostle, and then they'd both move on. But Jesus, in this text, becomes extremely angry. He turns to the boy and says, with chilling finality, "You shall not go on your way." And the boy, instantly, falls and dies on the spot. Just drops. Dead. You can imagine the collective gasp, the sudden silence in the bustling village. The parents of this boy also descend upon Joseph, their grief undoubtedly mixed with terror and fury. "You cannot live with the boy like this among us in the village," they plead, or perhaps demand, "for he is killing our children." At this point, Joseph, understandably at his wit's end, finally decides to scold Jesus more assertively. You can picture him, a stern look on his face, trying to lay down the law. But Jesus, knowing that this scolding stems from accusations made by other people, things Joseph hadn't actually witnessed but had been reported to him, responds in a way that's, well, let's just say it's not typical child behavior. He makes all his accusers in the village blind. Bam. Instant darkness for anyone who dared to point a finger. Talk about a dramatic defense mechanism. And Joseph? He's clearly not thrilled with this particular reaction to his parental discipline. He loses his temper and gives Jesus a literal ear pull, tugging his ear with force. You might think, finally, some normal parenting. But Jesus, deeply annoyed by this physical correction, turns the tables on his father. He says to Joseph, "It is enough for you to seek and not to find. Surely you have not acted wisely. Do you not know that I am your own?" It's a cryptic statement, full of a wisdom that belies his tender years, turning the scolding back on Joseph. What exactly did he mean by, "You have not acted wisely," or, "I am your own"? Historians still argue whether this implies a recognition of Joseph's adoptive role or a deeper, more divine claim. Regardless, it leaves Joseph speechless, a parent completely outmaneuvered by his preteen progeny. Amidst this chaos, a teacher who happens to be nearby is absolutely floored by Jesus' way of speaking to his father. He's so impressed by this precocious child that he volunteers to begin Jesus' formal education. You might think, great, finally some structure, some discipline. But the problem, as you'll soon discover, is that during these lessons, Jesus ends up teaching much more to the teacher than the teacher teaches him. For instance, the teacher begins by diligently instructing Jesus in the Greek letters. He's probably drawing them in the sand, patiently explaining their shapes and sounds. But Jesus, instead of passively absorbing the lesson, interrupts. He begins to teach the secret and deeper meaning of the letters to the teacher, revealing esoteric knowledge that leaves the poor man utterly embarrassed for not having that more advanced understanding himself. It's like trying to teach a physics Nobel laureate how to build a paper airplane. The teacher, thoroughly humbled, ends up returning the boy to Joseph, admitting defeat. "I cannot endure the severity of his gaze," he sighs, probably wiping sweat from his brow, "nor understand even once his word. This boy is not born of this world. He must have been born before the creation of the world." He even advises Joseph, "Take him to your house. He is great. He is either a god or an angel, or what shall I say? I do not know." You can almost hear the faint echo of a modern school teacher saying, "This kid is clearly gifted, but he's just too much for me." After this rather traumatic educational experience, two other teachers bravely, or perhaps foolishly, attempt to educate Jesus. The first of these also starts with the basics, Greek letters. And, predictably, Jesus interrupts again, launching into a profound discourse about the hidden meaning behind each of the letters. But this new teacher is less patient than the first one. Perhaps he's had a long day, or maybe he just doesn't appreciate being schooled by a child. So, he immediately slaps Jesus on the head. A disciplinary smack, you might think, a common enough occurrence in ancient schooling. Big mistake. You can almost hear the ominous music swelling. Jesus, of course, immediately curses the teacher, and he falls down stiff on the ground. Not a mild inconvenience, not a temporary paralysis. Just stiff. On the ground. Dead. Apparently, corporal punishment was not in Jesus' lesson plan. Finally, a third teacher, even knowing about the previous stories, which is to say, being incredibly brave, or perhaps incredibly desperate for a challenge, asks for the opportunity to teach Jesus. This teacher, you'll be relieved to hear, also ends up being educated by the boy. But instead of losing his patience or resorting to violence, he acknowledges Jesus' superiority. He shows humility. And because of this teacher's wisdom and self-awareness, Jesus decides to perform an act of grace. He resurrects the other teacher, the one he had cured, or rather, cursed stiff. It's a moment of surprising mercy in a text that has otherwise been rather unmerciful. It's a quirky tidbit that reveals a slightly different side of Jesus, perhaps a hint of the compassionate figure familiar from the canonical Gospels. You realize that even in this wild narrative, there's a thread of the familiar Jesus, if only for a moment. This whole school adventure paints a very different picture of childhood learning in antiquity, doesn't it? You're not just worried about getting a bad grade, you're worried about getting withered or struck dead. A challenging education. You observe the young Jesus' encounters with various teachers, each learning more from him than they impart, often with surprising and painful results. Apart from these somewhat chaotic school adventures, The Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas also recounts various other stories that unfold in different contexts, painting a broader picture of young Jesus' life. Since there are many, you'll get just a few of the most interesting ones here, the highlights reel, if you will. In one particular story, you find Jesus out with his brother James. They're probably just doing chores, or perhaps gathering firewood, something mundane that quickly turns extraordinary. A viper, lurking in the undergrowth, bites James's hand. You can almost feel the sudden sharp pain, the creeping numbness, as James starts to lose strength, the poison beginning its work. But Jesus, ever the swift problem solver and miracle worker, doesn't panic. He quickly blows on the bite on James's hand. And this isn't just a gentle breath, mind you. This causes the viper, the very creature that inflicted the wound, to explode. Yes, you heard that right. It literally explodes. And with the serpentine explosion, his brother James recovers completely, as if nothing had happened. A rather dramatic method of venom extraction, you might think, but effective nonetheless. In another very interesting story, you're transported to a scene of childhood play, which, as you've learned, often goes sideways with Jesus around. He's playing on a roof with other boys, a common enough pastime in ancient villages, though probably not one approved by modern health and safety regulations. You can imagine the shouts, the laughter, the daring antics. And then, tragedy strikes. One of the boys accidentally falls from the roof and dies. The other boys, terrified, scatter, running away from the scene as fast as their legs can carry them. But Jesus, calm amidst the chaos, remains at the scene. So, when the parents of the deceased boy appear, their hearts undoubtedly shattered, they immediately jump to conclusions. You can hear their accusations, their voices thick with grief and fury, blaming Jesus for throwing their son from the roof. It's what it looked like, after all, judging by the scene they were witnessing. But Jesus, of course, had not done that, and he denies the accusation. However, the parents, blinded by their anguish, insist on blaming and insulting him. It's a moment where you see the raw emotion of ordinary people clashing with the extraordinary, and sometimes terrifying, power of this child. So what does Jesus do? He doesn't just calmly explain himself again. Oh no. He jumps from the roof, a leap that would surely shatter mortal bones, goes to the body of the dead boy, and shouts, "Zeno. Which was the boy's name? Get up and tell me, did I throw you from the roof?" And the boy, Zeno, who moments before was undeniably dead, gets up. He opens his eyes, looks around, and responds, "No, sir, you did not throw me, but you raised me." The parents of the boy are, as you can imagine, absolutely astonished by this. Their accusations turn into profound gratitude as they thank God for this undeniable miracle. It's a rather dramatic way to clear your name, resurrecting the deceased witness, wouldn't you agree? This serves as a testament to the popular belief in miracles in ancient times, a mainstream historical fact that pervades many religious texts. In several other stories, the young Jesus continues to perform spectacular feats, frequently resurrecting children and adults. It's almost as if he's the neighborhood's designated first responder, but with divine flair. But there are also stories in which Jesus does things that are impressive but not exactly miraculous in the sense of defying natural law. For example, in one account, you find Joseph, Jesus' adoptive father, busy with his trade as a carpenter. He's building a bed for a rich man, a significant commission no doubt. But disaster strikes, he ends up making a piece too short for the bed. You can practically hear his sigh of frustration, the imminent threat of having to scrap the entire project, costing him time, materials, and reputation. But Jesus, ever the ingenious problem solver, finds a clever technical solution right there to fix the problem. It's almost like an ancient engineering feat, a display of practical genius rather than raw divine power. He saves the day for his Father's work, showcasing an intelligence and resourcefulness that goes beyond mere magical ability. Historians still argue whether these non-miraculous feats were included to make Jesus more relatable or to emphasize his human ingenuity alongside his divine nature. It's a quirky tidbit that rounds out the portrayal of a multifaceted prodigy. So, in general, you see that these stories from the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas affirm not only the magical power, so to speak, of Jesus, his ability to give life to clay birds or resurrect the dead, but also his sharp intelligence and his profound knowledge of human and divine things. He's not just a walking miracle machine, he's also a brilliant mind, a polymath of sorts, even in childhood. And then, there's one last story that's worth mentioning, a very famous one, and it concludes this curious book. But here's the twist, this last story isn't famous because of this apocryphal gospel. It's famous because of a canonical gospel, the Gospel of Luke. This is the story you might remember from the beginning of our discussion, the only real glimpse into Jesus' childhood from the traditional biblical texts. It's when Mary and Joseph go with Jesus to Jerusalem when he was 12 years old. They're probably part of a larger pilgrimage, a bustling crowd of people traveling together. And on the way back, in the hustle and bustle of returning home, they somehow end up leaving the boy behind. You can imagine the dawning panic, the frantic searching, the realization that their precocious, sometimes terrifying, son isn't with the group. So, when they finally realize Jesus was not with them, they retrace their steps, filled with anxiety, all the way back to Jerusalem. And where do they find him? Sitting with various teachers, renowned scholars of the law and the prophets, deeply engaged in discussion, and impressing everyone with his profound knowledge of the scriptures. This story, as you know, is in the Gospel of Luke, and it's one of the very few passages you find in the canonical Gospels about the childhood of Jesus. It almost serves as a bridge between the wild tales of the infancy gospel and the more subdued canonical narratives. In a way, as you might remember from the video about the Gospel of James, his silence about what happened in the early years of Jesus was probably a decisive stimulus to drive the production of these later Gospels that specifically address the origin and childhood of Jesus, attempting to fill in the blanks where the mainstream texts left gaping holes. Beyond the classroom you discover other extraordinary events in Jesus' youth, including healings, resurrections, and displays of remarkable ingenuity. Well, before you settle in for the night, it's worth considering a question that inevitably pops up throughout the reading of this book. How can the greatest character of Christianity, Christ himself, be represented as a child who is apparently so ill-mannered that he kills friends and teachers for any little thing, and doesn't even accept a scolding from his own father? You're probably scratching your head, wondering, how could a text like this have been useful in promoting worship of Jesus, strengthening his identification as the Messiah, as the Son of God, as the Savior of humanity, or anything like that? It seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it? Like trying to promote a brand by highlighting all its most terrifying features. So, despite the young Jesus of the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas not being exactly the humblest or the most welcoming, you know, the kind of kid you'd gladly invite to a play date, unless you wanted your lawn to wither or your goldfish to explode, he is certainly very, very powerful. He is the one who takes people's lives and restores them, a celestial give and take, a divine resurrectionist. He purifies what is impure with just the power of his word, turning murky water into crystal clear pools, or perhaps turning a bad mood into, well, let's just say you wouldn't want to be the one with the bad mood around him. He knows all things, whether human or divine, like an ancient Google, but with a much more immediate and sometimes fatal search result. So, he really has many characteristics of a god, even if those characteristics are a bit intense. And even some of the more frightening things, like killing a boy just because he accidentally bumped into him, can be considered perfectly divine if you consider the imagery about God that existed in that ancient context. You see, the God of the Old Testament, the God of the Hebrew Bible, wasn't always depicted as a gentle, loving deity. There was a lot of fear, a lot of holy terror, involved. Perhaps you recall, for example, the story of Uzzah and the Ark of the Covenant. In this story, the Ark of the Covenant, which was where God was enthroned according to the text, was being transported on a cart. It was a sacred, untouchable object, like a divine antique that came with very specific handling instructions. And at a certain moment, the oxen carrying this cart stumble, and the cart jolts precariously. A man named Uzzah, who was accompanying the transportation of the ark, immediately, and probably instinctively, stretches out his hand and grabs the ark to prevent it from falling. A good Samaritan, you might think, just trying to help. But because of this, immediately, the wrath of God is kindled against Uzzah, as the text chillingly says, and Uzzah is struck dead right there, falling lifeless beside the Arkansas. Talk about a strict no-touch policy. This story about the untouchable and terrifying holiness of God, and several other similar stories from the Hebrew Bible, may have inspired this untouchable and terrifying image of the young Jesus from the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas. It's like a divine, ancient version of, "Don't mess with me." As the famous saying goes, the feared leader gets better obedience than the loved one. So perhaps the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas sought to promote Christian piety more along these lines, not so much by the image of the Lamb of God, but by that of the Lion of Judah. Not so much by the love of Christ, but by the fear of the Lord. It's a subtle but significant shift in theological emphasis, a focus on power and authority rather than meekness and humility. Historians still argue whether this text was intended to truly depict a historical Jesus or to convey theological truths through allegorical tales. It's a fascinating, if unsettling, debate. The message, you see, is more or less the following: think twice before wanting to know more than Jesus, like those unfortunate teachers in the story who ended up embarrassed, or worse. Think twice before accusing him of anything, like those villagers who ended up blind in the story. And absolutely, unequivocally, think twice before getting in his way, like the boy who was running and then ended up dead. It's a rather blunt, no-nonsense approach to spiritual obedience, wouldn't you agree? This emphasis on fear as a motivator for religious devotion is a quirky tidbit that sets this gospel apart from the more familiar narratives of compassion and forgiveness. But anyway, that's the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas. As you've discovered tonight, it's a book that has been widely read since the early history of Christianity. It still exists today in the form of dozens of manuscripts in various languages, a testament to its enduring, if perhaps unsettling, popularity. And you can even read it now in Portuguese, thanks to the excellent translation by Professor Frederico Lorenzo from the University of Coimbra, for those of you who want to dive directly into the text and explore the other apocryphal Gospels that are out there. And if you're still curious after this, you might check out the video about the Gospel of James, which talks a bit more about the historical context of these external Gospels to the Bible, how they fit into the broader tapestry of early Christian thought. Understanding the terrifying child, you ponder the complex and often unsettling portrayal of the youthful Jesus, examining how this ancient text might have aimed to inspire fear and reverence. So, you've journeyed through the unsettling yet undeniably fascinating world of the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas, glimpsing a childhood of divine power mixed with a fiery temper. You've seen a young Jesus who, unlike the gentle figure you might be more familiar with, wasn't afraid to flex his celestial muscles, often with rather shocking consequences. From animating clay birds to withering a boy for a minor infraction, or even striking another dead for a simple bump, this version of Jesus demands your attention, not just your affection. He's the kind of child who ensures that when you're playing his way, or not at all. And those teachers? Well, let's just say their lessons were far more perilous than any pop quiz. You've learned that this ancient text offers a stark contrast to the canonical Gospels, which remain remarkably silent on Jesus' early years, except for that single, brief account in Luke. This silence, as you now understand, likely fueled the creation of these apocryphal tales, filling the gaps in a narrative that many early Christians craved. They wanted to know everything about their Messiah, even the bits that might make you squirm a little. The portrayal of a powerful, even fearsome, young Jesus might seem counterintuitive to a faith built on love and forgiveness. But remember that ancient context. The concept of God in the Old Testament often included a terrifying holiness, a divine power that demanded absolute reverence and, yes, even fear. Think of Uzzah and the Ark of the Covenant, a story where an act of well-intentioned helpfulness was met with instant, fatal wrath. This wasn't a God you took lightly, and the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas seems to imbue the young Jesus with a similar, formidable majesty. It's a divine presence that tolerates no disrespect, no challenge, and certainly no accidental bumps in the road. The message is clear: this is a Jesus who demands respect, not just love. He's the Lion of Judah, not just the Lamb of God. It's a pragmatic approach to faith, perhaps, where obedience is born of awe and trepidation as much as devotion. You're meant to think twice before questioning him, before accusing him, before getting in his way. This is a Jesus who will make his point, decisively and unequivocally. This isn't the kind of bedtime story you'd tell to guarantee sweet dreams, is it? More like a cautionary tale, a reminder of the immense power and authority that this divine child possessed, even before his public ministry began. It's a glimpse into how diverse early Christian beliefs were, how different communities interpreted and expanded upon the life of their central figure. While it might challenge your modern sensibilities, it offers a window into the complex theological landscape of antiquity, a time when the boundaries of narrative and divinity were explored in ways that continue to intrigue and sometimes shock us today. But for now, that's it for the Gospel of the Infancy of Thomas. The references consulted, as always, are available if you want to dive deeper into the scholarly discussions surrounding this intriguing text. Thank you very much for listening, and don't forget to leave your own interpretations of these stories in the comments below. As the echoes of these ancient tales begin to fade, let your mind drift from the curious, powerful child of Nazareth. Imagine the soft glow of a distant lamp, barely illuminating the edges of your room. The day's worries, the rush of thoughts, they too begin to dim, like embers settling in a hearth. Feel the quiet hush of the night drawing in, wrapping you in its gentle embrace. Your breath deepens, slowing, becoming a rhythm, a soft hum that lulls you deeper into stillness. Your body relaxes, sinking heavier into the comfort beneath you, every muscle unwinding, every thought becoming softer, until all that remains is the whisper of the night.